Welcome back to Horns High Studios for another episode of True Crime Deep Cuts. And I'm here with Blahgergirl for this Brent Kopacka Idaho 4 episode. Blahgergirl, how you doing today? I know you're still a little bit under the weather.
Man. Yeah, I got strep and a little bit of pneumonia going on, so I'm getting over it, but doing better now. So hopefully we can knock this out and do a really good episode for everybody.
Yeah, it stinks when we're not feeling well and trying to be all excited about a topic, but we've put in the work for this one, and I think it's going to be good. So this is our third video in this new long form series. This is not a 666 seconds video, so the stopwatch is not out. I got to put away, and we're talking about a topic that needs a little more time than that. And this will be as long as it needs to be, but we know your time is very valuable, so we will not waste time, but we do have a bunch of stuff to talk about. But it is important to remember with all of these videos, these are just for informational purposes only. These are just our opinions and speculation. We're not saying anybody is guilty of anything. So, all right, now we got one hell of an episode here to do, but it is a very sad story. We're going to do this with the utmost respect because we are talking about a U.S. Army soldier who suffered a traumatic brain injury in Iraq and came home suffering tremendously from PTSD. And I've said it before, I'm a disabled Army veteran myself. I served during Desert Storm from 1991 to 94. So I do not want to do anything to disrespect this man, okay? But we're going to talk about this because, Blahgergirl, we did, this interview that I did with GW Ayers, who's a retired Army soldier who I served with at Fort Hood, and he suffers from PTSD, was in combat in the same area where Brent Kopacka was in Iraq. Yeah. But what did you think about the interview? Because you got to see the whole thing.
I did. I got a little sneak peek and I liked it a lot. It just reminded me, as I had a best friend that I lost who was a veteran as well. And so it just to see your camaraderie with him was really just wonderful to watch. And after so long too, it just feels like no time. It appeared like no time had passed between the two of you. So it was really cool to see. And it definitely came out the struggles with PTSD, what that is, and he was very honest about his journey, and I really liked that about him because it's going to make other veterans feel like they can be honest about what's going on, and get the help that they need, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. And I just want to say thank you to you and to him for your service because it means a lot to me, like that you guys do what you do and did what you did, so I appreciate that. And first and foremost, and second, it was just a wonderful insight into your guys' minds and what you've had to deal with, especially himself being in the same area as Brent. Just giving a little more insight to something I feel like Brent would have said himself. So it was interesting to see his perspective.
Yeah, I have not seen anyone offer that perspective. And I got thinking, boy, I've got the people I know, and GW was just a great choice. I haven't seen him for 30 years. I did interview him about 10 years ago. I wrote a short story called Bodies in My Pocket about somebody suffering from PTSD. And he was one of the people I talked to get more of an insight into what that's like. So I knew, he would be a great resource. And so yeah, we're going to have a few different clips of this interview. So this first one here is where GW and I talk about the areas in Iraq where he and Brent Kopacka were in combat. So let's check this out. But when it comes to this Idaho 4 case, GW, the name Brent Kopacka comes up often, and he was that former 82nd Airborne soldier that suffered a traumatic brain injury and then following PTSD. And you told me a little bit about what his experience in theater may have been like. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about that and the unit that he was in?
So the unit he was in, 82nd Airborne Division, we haven't dropped anybody into combat since, well, we did in Afghanistan in the very early days of the war, but we haven't had a major airborne deployment. So that unit deployed just like everybody else, They deployed into ground vehicles and they used them in the combat. The thing I find unfortunate that my unit trained for years together, then we deployed for a deployment. And then the Army says, okay, I promise you when you get back, you'll have 18 months and then you go back again. So you have at least 18 months out of theater to reintegrate with your family and have babies and figure out what you're going to do next and maybe move to a new job. But what happened to a lot of these guys is the surge happened, right?
Right.
And then the surge, during the surge, a lot of these units deployed for 18 months.
Wow.
That's a long ass time.
Yeah, that is.
And then they would be back. All right, so you're in a unit for a year, then you deploy for 18 months, and you come back on your redeployment thing. So now you're in 3 to 4 years at this one unit. The Army says you got to move to another unit. Then you move to a unit that has deployment orders. Holy shit! So now move to a unit, and now 6 months after you come back from combat, you're back in the shit, right?
Wow.
So you never really get to decompress and exercise your resiliency, is what the military is calling it right now, which is fighter resiliency, is being able to, one, recognize the fact that you're going to go and do things that normal humans would never have to be asked of, and two, you're going to have the psychological effects of, one, being away from your loved ones, two, the loneliness associated with even though you're surrounded by 800-900 of your closest friends, because you're separated from what you know and love, which is the United States of America and everything that we have to offer ourselves and others. And three, you're going to be asked to do things, lack of sleep, lack of proper nutrition, stress just piled on top of you, and you have zero things at the time. You had zero recourse to deal with. All those things combined are horrible. So I suspect what happened to this gentleman is he was in the 82nd Airborne, probably did a couple one-year deployments, probably did a couple 6 to 9 month deployments with very little recovery time in between. I don't know for sure without looking at his record, but but knowing what I know about that unit, number one, and knowing what I know about the deployment cycle really closely after I got out. Like I looked at some of his history, and we were on the same piece of dirt at different times.
Okay.
So I know that place is where I was stationed and where I went was very violent. I know during the surge there was a lot of shooting and a lot of casualties taken. And what do we do? So you get one of your buddies killed in combat, right? The Army says, okay, we're going to have a memorial ceremony for that. So all your grieving is done then.
Right.
And then when you leave that ceremony, you're expected to flip the switch and then go back into soldier without a care, only taking care of orders mode. And man, human beings can't do that.
Right.
Can't.
No. Yeah, I know that you said he was in a pretty hot area. So, I mean, if they're sending in the 82nd Airborne, I'm guessing it would have been pretty hostile situation.
Yeah, I mean, everybody, these combat units, I was in the prestige of the 82nd Airborne precedes them, right? They have a very rich history, and they have a history of going places where our country needs them the most, and that's true. That's what happens. But they had the same unit, or they had the same missions that my guys had in the Striker Brigade. Same thing. Sometimes they had less survivable means at their disposal because they were mounted in Humvees and we were in a highly survivable vehicle being the Striker.
Well, Blahgergirl, I recently did a video, as we know, about Brent Kopacka and Brian Kohberger and some of those weird similarities. I mean, the fact they grew up 40 miles from each other. I mean, how strange is that to end up 2,500 miles away in Pullman, Washington? What do you think about that?
I didn't even know that until your video. So that was very interesting, that the same initials, things like you don't even think about, but you're like, wow, that's
right. 3-syllable names.
Yes, absolutely.
Initials the same. Yeah. The names almost sound similar. It's weird.
It is very strange.
Yeah.
That they had so much similarities to each other, and they supposedly didn't even know each other. So
Right.
that's what was weird about it.
Yeah, definitely. But Brent Kopacka served in the 82nd Airborne from 2005 to 2009. He did 2 tours in Iraq during his service. And as GW was talking about, you know, these guys are sometimes almost going back to back over there, which is just really rough. But on the second tour, he was injured by an IED, which is an improvised explosive device, while he was in a Humvee. And another odd coincidence with the Idaho 4 crimes is that the Moscow PD lead detective on the case, Mr. Brett Payne himself, the weird bald dude, was an MP in the 82nd Airborne at roughly the same time as Brent. I mean, in a case of just bizarre coincidences, what do you think about that?
I didn't even know that. I mean, I knew that he had the military background, Payne, but I didn't know that close of similarities to Brent. And so that was really interesting to find out. I mean, it just keeps happening, though. I mean, every time we look into a certain topic, there's some weird connections between parties within this town,
right?
Or or in this case, the neighboring town, because it's not that far. And like you said, they're really isolated little cities or towns in the area, and so there's not really much else around. And I found that was, I mean, what are the odds that the lead investigator in the Idaho 4 murders is in the same like airborne division as Brent at the same time, around the same time?
Yes.
Like, it's just,
I mean, it's very possible they knew each other, but you know, 82nd Airborne would be like saying I work for a big factory in your town. I mean, there's people that work there that you don't really know, you know?
Exactly.
So I mean, it's we're not saying, you know, this is a very high likelihood that they knew each other, but just the possibility of it is so strange, you know?
Yeah. That they could have crossed paths and not even known.
Right.
And that's what's crazy.
But I know from being in the Army myself, when you meet somebody that's from your state, especially the same area, there is a little bit of a tie. Now, we know that Brent was not from, you know, Idaho, but he had family in that area, I believe. So, you know, there could have been some sort of tie. It's hard to say. But Brent Kopacka suffers a traumatic brain injury, and he's sent home to recover, medically discharged with a Purple Heart, and then begins to suffer from terrible PTSD. And even 15 years later was still having major problems. But I mean, what kind of crippling problem was this in his life, Blahgergirl? I mean, how much did this really affect what he was doing?
Well, I watched the Thought Riot podcast. I know you had suggested that maybe I take a look because they just done a really good deep dive on it.
Yeah.
And they showed that clip of a couple that they were not going to name. They weren't doxing those people, but they talked about knowing Brent and what he was dealing with, and it seemed like it was an everyday issue for him. And so when I was hearing GW and what he was dealing with, it sounded very, very similar type of issues, but it's like GW was getting the help that he needed versus Brent wasn't. Brent was turning to like meth, and he was turning to, you know, substances to help. I did find that his roommates were really weird in that clip. I mean, hearing about how they were treating him. So I definitely want to dive into that a little bit later. But that interview with those people kind of gave me insight into maybe who Brent was a little bit. And he seemed, from them and their perspective, that they trusted him around their kids. That he was very like loved and they cared for him, and that he was a good person. And so for me, it's like it kind of changed my perspective on the idea of him having to do with this case. And then all the things that like I've seen in other creators' videos of the inconsistencies with the body cams and things like that, I was starting to go, maybe he didn't have anything to do with this, and this is something else going on here. Like I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, how many things have we uncovered with this police department? So.
Exactly. No, there's all sorts of suspicion every which way you turn in this case, and this is just adds to the whole thing, you know. But we're going to listen to what GW had to say about PTSD specifically, what it's like to suffer with something like that. As you said, he's very candid with me, as well as, you know, on the channel that he does, which I'll talk about. And he's done videos about this. So I think, I'll link to that in the description below so you can watch it. But let's check out this next clip talking about PTSD. So speaking of that, I mean, you've been very candid about your experiences suffering with PTSD. So I wondered if you could explain to the viewers a little more about it and maybe what we don't know, because I'm sure what we're hearing, through reading articles and stuff, maybe isn't capturing the true essence of what that's about for the guys like yourself that have dealt with that.
Well, and returning from combat, I did all kinds of things wrong, right? I returned from combat. I transitioned from Army into the civilian world like very rapidly within 90 days. And we do what we always do, right? We just push and cram all our emotions down. And it's like you only got, like, as we continue to cram it in and put a lid on it, cram it in, put a lid on it, cram it in, put a lid on it, it's like a trash compactor that's out of room after a while. So you can't cram any more in, so it's got to squirt out somewhere. And if you put something new in, maybe something old squirts out and raises its angry head. I remember the first exhibit of bad behavior associated with PTSD. When you're in combat, you're the master, especially at the job I held. I was the master of everything that I could see. If I wanted you to do something, you did it, right? Or we took you away.
Right.
or worse.
Right.
So if there was a two-way kinetic environment, then we did what we had to do. I never, this is going to sound horrible, but I never suffered any guilt for having to apply kinetic or apply my skills to someone who was trying to kill me or my soldiers or other people. I never felt bad about that. The source of my grief and the source of my angst is, I had to order people to do some things that they didn't come back from. And I don't think that that would be something I have to carry around with me forever. Yeah. But back to the story. I was in a mall. I was getting my cell phone turned back on, and there was a kid standing next to me screaming for a friend of his, like really loud. And when I say kid, he was probably 16, 17 years old. He was over 6 foot tall. He was actually bigger than I was. And I snapped on the spot. I just said, I just used a bunch of bad language. I called him everything I could call him. I said, and he says, I'm just looking for my friend. And I remember telling him to as clear as day, I said, if you don't shut your mouth, they're going to be looking for you. Damn. And that's when the person I was with at the time pulled me away. And then the funny backstory to that is I calmed down and went back to the kiosk to get my cell phone turned back on. And I apologized to the guy that was helping me. I said, I'm sorry I had an outburst. He goes, sir, if I could do that every day, I would. So I felt a little vindicated, but I did get my motorcycle home and got the hell out of there as quick as I could before dude's dad showed up. And then I really had to have some problems.
Wow.
But that was one of the first times where I felt myself just turn on the spot and not be totally in control of my emotions at the time.
Wow.
And it over the next, I've been, from 2006 until now, 18 years, I've had times in my life where I found myself in that emotional boil over, basically. And then about 3 years ago, I decided that I probably should talk to somebody about it. It was a two-pronged thing. The VA said, probably has some PTSD, you should talk to somebody. Right. And our VA here in Wichita is one of the best I've ever been associated. And so I went down to the vet center. That's not, so what the VA has done, which is really cool, is they've built these vet centers off campus of the VA. So if you got a bad taste in your mouth of the VA, but you can go to the vet center, you get a lot better. You feel better about it. And I met my counselor. Was a nice lady. She gave me a lot of tools. We unpacked some stuff that was bothering me from combat, and unpacked some stuff that happened to me way before combat, and even in my childhood that I didn't know was grinding on me. So
interesting.
Gave me the tools. Gave me some literature to read, and there was most of the stuff that was interesting to me was Vietnam War veterans writing about their experiences and how they overcame the stuff that they were dealing with. And I was reading these books and I'm like, shit, I feel the same way these people do.
Wow.
And and we could talk, I'm sure we're going to talk about some other things over the next few minutes. But once I started to know that, well, first, I didn't think I was nuts. And I didn't think I faced the same demons as people that I hear about that are incapacitated by this stuff, are acting out and criminals. And I didn't think I was, so I didn't seek treatment because I didn't feel like that. I didn't, the behavior didn't manifest itself, but I felt horrible all the time. I felt bad. I didn't like me. I didn't think I was doing good things. I knew that no more, and what was worse is I would do good things and people would say, hey man, that was a great job, or we really appreciate you being around. I would immediately feel guilty because I didn't think I was worthy of that. Right.
Oh, wow.
And so once I was able to accept the fact that, dude, I'm pretty okay. Right. And then I got the counseling I needed and I got to talk about it and honestly, cried about it, prayed about it, and I feel much better. Just the little tools she gave me that I use today.
That's amazing.
So let me just explain to you what happens in a soldier's brain. I used to use a little bit of prayer. I used to use a little bit of meditation prior to and directly after a patrol that would cause me to get my body reset, right? But I can remember, and the thing I had that sticks with me to this day is the cloud of dread. The cloud of dread.
Wow.
That cloud of dread is over your head every second of your life there. And then when you come home and you got a redeployment or you got a deployment order, now you got more cloud of dread. Right? You never get out from under it. And it is a crippling emotion. Even to this day, I'll wake up in the middle of the night and saying, oh my God. And then I have to tell myself, I'm like, brother, you're laying next to a beautiful woman. You're in a safe environment. The sounds you're hearing is not gunfire, it's your dog snoring. So those things, on cue.
Yeah. So hearing that kind of stuff, I mean, that is just so sad that so many veterans suffer from that. I mean, I'm very fortunate I was not in combat. I don't have those same kind of issues. I've got my own issues, but not those. So knowing to some extent what Brent was dealing with and talking to GW is just very insightful. But, with the self-medicating, I mean, that sounds like a disaster here.
Yeah. It just makes me sad because I've actually seen it firsthand with my own friends, the PTSD physically.
Oh, okay.
What happens. I was dating one of his friends and he would jerk at night in his sleep, I'm like, don't kill me. I'm not an enemy. I swear, kind of vibes, because sometimes they relive it. And I went hiking with my best friend and there was a helicopter. Unfortunately, a girl needed to be airlifted out the day we go hiking.
Oh my gosh.
But yeah, so he hears the helicopter and like crouched down. And I could see that there was like those after effects of being in the theater, so I saw it firsthand just by being an outside perspective, watching what they obviously were dealing with and going through.
Right.
And then hearing GW's account of what he was dealing with, the fact that they go multiple times, and he said he's had people heard that they've gone 8 times, things like, I think that's ridiculous. I think one and done for you guys is enough, maybe 2, but when they're going back and back, but then after your episode, I was starting to think like maybe there's reasons why, because going into civilian life, I saw the struggles that the guys had with that. It's really hard to go from a regimented day, knowing what you have to do, you put your whole heart in what you're doing, and then to just like have nothing and your mind's empty, like it has time to think now, and all of a sudden all those things start coming back to you and you have to now deal with it. Like he said, you have to shut off after a funeral. Right. And he says that at one point, and then like go right back to work. And it's like humans aren't meant to do that. Like it's just like so sad. And
yeah, it is somewhat Brent, like being institutionalized, where they talk about that with inmates, because when you transition out of the Army, When I was in there, they put you through like a week-long course on how to write a resume, how to do job interviews. And I hadn't been in that long, but there's some of these guys that were in for 20, 25 years that just went right from high school into the Army. So, I mean, they didn't know any of that stuff, so they really needed it. So there are programs like that. I'm sure they still exist, and probably even more so now, but it's still, you get so reliant on the Army because, like, if you have a problem with your pay, you go to your supervisor and it gets handled. Like, they don't fool around with stuff like that. But in the civilian world, you know, if you have a problem with your pay with your employer, I mean, that can get ugly, and you're kind of out there on your own with that one, you know. So these guys get very reliant on being told what to do, that order, just what you were saying, but they get to where they need it. So when it's not there, that's like, whoa, you know, what do I do, you know?
Right. Well, then they have to take care of themselves, right? And then that's when they start medicating themselves or self-medicating because they don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah, and the stress of life in general for all of us is tough. But imagine being in a situation where you come from all that order and discipline to you could do anything you want. And a lot of people just do that to the fullest. Now, GW said that the traumatic brain injury and PTSD, definitely a bad combination. But when you add in these substances, plus that interview with that couple said he was using alcohol every day, you know, it's no wonder things turned out like they did. I mean, it's so sad. And especially when this happens to a soldier that's done 2 tours in combat and gets a Purple Heart. I mean, it's just absolutely heartbreaking.
It is.
And that interview you were talking about, you know, they knew Brent very well. You shouted out the Thought Riot podcast. I really love that channel.
I do too.
Yeah. And I'll link to that down in the episode description if you guys want to check that out because it's really good. Now, the couple said that he was a really nice guy and he was really good with their kids, you know, which, I mean, how much trust would you have to have in somebody that you knew had that dark side and yet you're letting them play with your kids? To me, that says a lot of the trust that they had in him, right?
Right. That he wasn't as violent as people have maybe made him out to be, or that he could be with regards to the Idaho 4. I mean, that gave me a whole new insight into who maybe he was, because for a couple to say, I'll let you be around my child, obviously his PTSD or his drug usage isn't as much of a concern for them to not let him be alone with their children.
Right.
So he obviously, he had those issues and he was dealing with it, but he wasn't violent to the sense that of what it's been made out to be and the reason why he was killed. And so that really bothers me. Like, there's a disconnect there that I'm trying to figure out why it's there, because they're making it sound like he was this violent person trying to kill his roommates. But then you have this couple who knew him personally that says, no, I'd let him be around my kids. So it's kind of like, well, why would he turn around and say, I'm going to kill people and be, you know, and there's questions to that. So I don't know if we have a segment part of this that I can talk about that, but I have a lot of thoughts on that.
When we get into the standoff, definitely we'll talk about that.
Absolutely.
So I was surprised to hear he wasn't getting help from the VA. According to that couple, was not medicated. He's self-medicating, but you know, we know that Brent lost his license in a DUI, and it wasn't there. You know, there wasn't a VA there locally in Pullman, so he just wasn't getting the services he needed.
Right.
And, you know, nowadays the VA has, you know, this, where what I use quite a bit, a system where you can get, you know, care from civilians if they don't offer it, and they'll pay for it. So
that's great.
I've used it for multiple things. So any veterans out there, ask your VA for the care. It's called Care in the Community, and that's where you can go to the civilian doctor if there's not that service there at your VA. Now,
did GW mention, I think he said TRICARE too. Wasn't that another one?
TRICARE is if you're retired from the Army, then you go into this like an insurance policy after service, like for
I see.
If you're retired. Not if you just like did 4 years and got out. So he was having major issues, you know, according to that couple, with these roommates of his. What was going on at the coffee house apartments there in Pullman, Blahgergirl?
Well, if you guys haven't seen it, the couple talks about how, you know, he had these roommates that were okay. So what I had originally heard was that the roommates were saying that they weren't fearful of him. And I thought, well, that's interesting because they're
Mm-hmm.
making it sound like he's this tirade type person shooting off, bullets and things like that. And I'm like, wait, what? Okay, maybe he really is having a PTSD breakdown. That's what I was thinking. But then when you hear this interview, it makes it sound like the roommates were antagonizing him in a way that to put it mildly, because we're trying to be friendly to people around, they were making sexual advances to him,
Right.
and making him very uncomfortable in his living space to the point where he was staying at hotels in Pullman and in Moscow,
Mm-hmm.
and he wasn't even staying at his residence and like going broke because of this.
Right.
And I was like, wait, what? Like that
Right.
is a total different viewpoint on this. What
I
did you think
know.
about that?
I thought it was weird because, you have to wonder, was this the PTSD? Was this the hallucinations that he had giving
Right.
him the impression that this was going on? But remember in that interview with the couple, they said that one of their friends was at the apartment and also saw this going on and was like, I'm out.
Right.
And he left. So maybe it really was happening, but I never heard of any of this in any of the stuff I looked at until I heard that interview on Thought Riot podcast. So that was really very eye-opening to me. But the fact that he was staying in hotels in Moscow, we're going to get into this, definitely is interesting because, we know that a lot of people from Pullman went to Moscow. Apparently the shopping was better there and people like going over there. And they're only 7 miles apart, so basically like twin cities. And so, to think he was in Moscow definitely makes me a bit more inclined to at least entertain the idea that he may have been involved in this thing. I mean, he's got insomnia. And just like Brent Kopacka, ironically, and like to walk around or run at night, another thing that Brent Kopacka liked to do. So there are certainly, if you want to go down that rabbit hole, which we're not in this video, but the similarities between these two are really uncanny. And you have to wonder if maybe, they could have had something to do with each other. But what do you think about that?
You know what? That's a good question. I mean, I want to say no. I feel like there's just a lot of coincidences between the two of them.
Mm-hmm.
There could be the drug angle if Brian was involved in that again.
Right.
That's the only other angle I can see how he would be connected to the Idaho 4 too, is because of if he was supplying something or involved in that way. That's the only other than them meeting him at the Mad Greek? Sorry, Mad Greek.
True.
That's the only other connection I'd see Brian with the 4. So connected with Brent, I'm thinking, okay, it has to be the drug angle. That's the only thing I can think of. But other than that, I don't see it. They lived close to each other, so that might have been how they maybe met.
Right. Running or out and about.
Maybe at night. Yeah, I mean, that's the only thing I can think of. But it's possible. I mean, anything's possible. Like you said, in this case, anything is possible. But as far as my personal opinion, I don't know. I don't think so. But I mean, it would make sense if they did. But I just don't know if a veteran would do something like this. So that's where I'm struggling with it.
Yeah. And I mean, I've got this theory that, if, what we're hearing about Brent is that he was using meth, that he could have run into Emma, Bailey, or Demetrius. We know that those two are allegedly supplying to that area. And, it's certainly possible, he could have owed them some money. Maybe that's how he could have got involved in the Idaho 4, or maybe they knew of his combat experience and that he suffered from PTSD and thought that he would be capable of that kind of violence, and could keep him in line with, a steady supply of what he needed. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, if it's drug related, then I can see how that would be manipulation. Just because, when they need that fix, they need that fix, and usually people will do anything to get it. So that's the only connection I can see, and I'm trying to figure out how he would have met Emma and Demetrius. But if it's in the drug world, then I could see that happening.
Exactly. And then, we also heard from Brent's good friend Darren Duncan, who was, that he talked about, Brent being really into slasher horror movies and all of that. And I've heard some people bring that up. It kind of makes me laugh because, so many people like horror movies and they don't do that kind of thing. But, he had this machete and Darren showed this display. But what did you think of, how Darren, stuck up for Brent? And he didn't think that Brian and Brent knew each other.
I mean, that would make sense. I mean, if it was my best friend, I would be very much at his defense too. And being like, what are you guys talking about? Especially if you know somebody. I can see like when people comment and they're like, I know these people personally, or whatever the case may be, they're gonna defend them because like for like the surviving roommates, people will come out and try to talk on their behalf because they can't say anything because of the gag order. And I get it, because
Right.
you love these people and you want them to be cleared, and they can't clear themselves. Like Brent's not alive to clear himself or speak for himself, so his best friend's going to do that for him. And I would do the same thing for my best friend.
Yeah.
I really hope that that's the case, that he has absolutely nothing to do with this, and it was just a tragic PTSD situation that should have been handled better by the VA and given him more help. And that's like you said, I think you mentioned it, or maybe GW did, where you can't force people to get help too.
Right.
So
Right.
you can give them all the help you want, but if they don't want it.
Right. And the horror movie stuff, like I said, millions of people are into that sort of thing. I'm a horror author. So, I've heard this kind of stuff forever, especially like in heavy metal, all those things rolled into one catch a lot of flack. So I don't really put a whole lot of credence in that end of it. But I asked GW about the Idaho 4 crimes and if he could see a scenario where someone suffering from PTSD like Brent would be capable of that kind of violence. So let's hear what he's got to say about it. Now, one of the things that comes up when Brent's name is in this Idaho 4 discussion is, could he have done the quadruple murder? And what I'm wondering about is, given what we know about him with all the things going on and the substance abuse and all of that, do you think somebody like that would be in control enough to do an act like that and to be able to walk out of there without leaving any trace? I mean, there's no evidence outside that house. I mean, and they give like a 10, 15-minute window, law enforcement does. I mean, it just seems to me to be a stretch, but I just was wondering if in that kind of a state, would you have the wherewithal to not leave evidence behind and all of that?
Well, man, look at, you just have to ask yourself, you look at all the answer is yes. I can't live inside that gentleman's head, but I know that what has happened in the past with other people, that very very stringent thought process, a very good amount of planning. One of the things we do well as military people is we plan well to the nth degree, and we rehearse it, right? To make sure that we know what we're doing, and it's almost second nature when we get to do it. Now, you know that as well as I do.
Right.
We rehearse brigade set battles, and we rehearsed what we would do in a gas attack as individuals.
Right.
To the point where it was second. So the fact that could he commit those murders and not leave any evidence behind? I don't know.
Yeah, and if he was working with somebody else too, that could have been possible to, maybe have somebody with him that was able to kind of keep it reined in. I don't know. I mean, it's all speculation, but
it's a pretty messy crime scene not to leave behind a lot of evidence, I would think.
Right. So when I interviewed GW, he talked about that cloud of dread when he was deployed into combat, and it was common among soldiers. And I thought that concept was very interesting, and something you just couldn't get away from. And it would come on even after he got home. And he also used the analogy of keeping the monster inside, that some veterans that are suffering from PTSD feel. It's really sad to hear this kind of stuff. I mean, I know you've been talking about your friends and people as a subject that, you're also very sympathetic of.
Yeah. It's just hard to hear that they feel that way about themselves,
Right.
and it's like after, in our eyes, they're heroes for what they've done and what they've put themselves through and their families and things like that and their bodies. There's those lasting effects that you guys have to deal with, not just mentally, but physically too. And
Right.
it's just sad to see that, they feel that way, and it's like, and it's crazy, we always say that we're our own worst enemy
Right.
and that, well, the way we feel about things is like 10 times worse than like, and what we think is like not even what's on other people's minds.
Right.
But it's
Right.
like that's in our head. It's like the worst case scenario.
Exactly.
And it was hard to hear him, like you said, it was hard to hear him talk about like that type of stuff. But it's good that he's talking about it, which I think is
Exactly.
so encouraging to other veterans. Like you can talk about these things. It doesn't make you less of a man or less
Right.
of a human being to do that.
Right.
Or a woman. And in essence, like it doesn't make you a worse human being for being open about what's going on in your head.
Right.
You're not a bad person for that. So,
Right.
yeah, I just want.
Of course. Now, after the Idaho 4 crimes, things come to a head with Brent Kopacka. He ends up in the international news cycle on December 15th of 2022, less than a month from those crimes in Idaho. Why don't you give us a little bit of information on what this standoff, and I use air quotes around that because I'm not really sure about it. So what do you guys say about this?
I honestly, after hearing every different creators and stuff, I don't think it happened. I think that like I'm with Crime Circus and Drip Drop and Truth and Transparency when they talk about these. Some people might have their feelings about these people, but as far as the information that they find, I feel that it is credence at times, when they bring it to our attention because they're the ones going through the whole FOIA requests and getting all this information and paying for that and everything. So I found I made a couple notes when I was watching different creators and what they've said. And like they said that when you watch the body cam footage, he says search warrant, not arrest warrant.
Right.
Which I thought was interesting. It's like, well,
what are you searching for?
Right. And then usually there's a list of what they've searched for. Like they have to like submit that to the court of what they're specifically looking for in a search warrant. And we don't have that.
Right.
And you guys you can talk about this with tear gassing. I'm sure you've seen it or been around it at some point and the smoke that comes from it. Now they were claiming it for hours. Yeah, I didn't see any smoke like on the body cam footage.
Right. I didn't see any either.
So the tear gassing, I think you could speak to, they were saying they were doing it for hours at a time. But when you look at the body cam footage, there's like little to no smoke in that apartment. Like I don't even see any. So it's kind of like, isn't tear gas supposed to be visible? I mean, I think you could probably speak on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very dense. It's choking. I mean, it's nasty stuff if you don't have, some sort of respirator on. So yeah, you would have seen it. I mean, like dry ice at a concert, you'd have seen it rolling out that door if they were really using it,
And correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't see any of the officers wearing those types of masks or coughing in the footage, like being around it for long periods of time. They're just talking like no problem. Another point that I had with that footage is that there's a missing time and date on one of the body cam footages, which I've never seen in my entire life. I mean, that's the reason you have that is to time and date what you're looking at so that they have that evidence.
Right.
So that was weird to me. They said, Brent never respond. You never hear Brent respond. You never hear him yelling things out or being irate or, and so in my mind, I feel like the theory that they gave is that they came in guns a-blazing and they killed him early on. And so then they had supposedly a training that morning that they were supposed to do. And so they made it seem like like they were doing like
a simulation.
I guess you would say like a simulation of what they were supposed to be doing in training and made it look like they were going into his apartment. So I thought that was interesting because you even hear them on the body cam say, we're going to be late for training. Yeah. So obviously they had one booked for that day.
What a weird thing to say if you're in the middle of a standoff. There was no like negotiator involved in this whole thing. And then what was the thing where they tried to call they called Darren, his friend, and said that they're going to put him in touch with Brent to try to talk him out of it, but said they would call him back, but then they never did.
Right.
So he was sitting there waiting.
Right. And then and why? If you're going to patch someone through to someone who really cares about this individual, then
Right.
do that. And as soon as possible, because you don't want them to harm themselves or somebody else. And there was other parts that they said that 911 audio recording was like repeating itself, which means like maybe they fabricated it because it was saying like the statement, "Do you want to have the keys for the apartment?" twice.
Oh,
And then
interesting.
it was at different points. And then what was the other one? Why hasn't, and he made a really good point, Crime Circus, just a shout out to him. He made a really good point about the 911 call not being released, even though this is a closed case, which made me think like, if
Right.
you're going to draw that parallel to the Idaho 4, well, Idaho 4 is an open case. So if there is a connection there, maybe that's why it hasn't been released.
That's
But I do
interesting.
find that's weird that we haven't heard it yet.
Yeah, I mean this area is the most messed up I've ever seen. I mean, we it's just one after another, questions, concerns. That police the press conference they did was incredibly sketchy, where they were talking about what happened and the whole who called 911. They didn't really, give any real information. Again, like Idaho 4 with the 911 call, who made the 911 call? We don't know.
Right.
The people that lived in the building, that some of them that were interviewed said they had no idea that there was a standoff going on. Now, you would think if I don't know how big this apartment building was. The pictures of it didn't look that big, but you've got a standoff going on in the building you live in. I'm pretty sure you would know, SWAT team, megaphone, like barricades up, none of that. None of that. And that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Well, and then the part about I've seen multiple clips, different creators, all of them have said they heard, I think even during that interview with that couple, that there was only one gunshot that
One
they heard.
shot, right. I've heard that too.
Which would go to the theory that they shot him early.
I
and
agree.
it was killing of Brent. So I'm like, that makes way more sense to me
Right.
than what people have been putting out about him being this monster or being, connected with Idaho 4. I'm like, there's something shady going on there. So now I'm starting to question any of that, because it's like all this body cam footage and stuff in just the case with Brent alone doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, and the person that shot him, the WSU officer, Brett Boyd, I was confused at how a university's got a SWAT team, but I think I read somewhere else it's like an area SWAT team. So maybe he was with WSU, but he was also part of this team. I'm not sure, but that would make more sense than a university having a SWAT team. That's kind of crazy to think. But I just don't know. I mean, so many things just don't make any sense here. I mean, I'm just not seeing a standoff going on in my apartment building. It seems like a staged event to me, like you were saying with the body cam. I mean, just really nuts. And the fact that they could have had Darren talk to him leads me to believe that he was already gone. And I think this was all a charade. And then what about the phone they found on the counter there in the apartment? What was up with that phone?
I don't know. You got to tell me more about that. I don't know too much about it.
It was wiped completely clean, like a factory reset on the phone.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Why would that have been done? I mean, that even screams more of some sort of police cover up here, of maybe trying to hide, and again, I don't know why they would do that. If there was something on his phone that would have maybe made them, their story not hold water, so they reset his phone. I don't know why Brent would have done that. I don't know. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
I've seen cases where they can, even if they do a factory reset, they can still gain information from that phone.
Yeah, we hear that all the time, that nothing's even ever erased from a computer.
No,
so
I don't believe so.
I don't get that either, but that's how I've heard it, mentioned, that there was nothing there because the phone was wiped clean. But nobody's hearing all these shots that they claimed he was shooting in the apartment. Like you said, I've heard the roommates said that they weren't threatened. So I don't know what's up with that.
And to make a point about that, they're not threatened because they're the ones that were, like, according to this couple, threatening him.
Oh.
So that's how I view it. It's like, of course you're not threatened. You're the one doing the threats, according to this couple,
Interesting.
So
Right. And I need another thing too, is this could have been a death by cop type situation. I mean, we know that's a thing. People in that state of mind, maybe that, I mean, we talked about that, he had those visions or dreams of that's how, he was going to get shot by the police. And I'm wondering if it was one of these like self-fulfilling prophecy type things, it's sad, but certainly possible.
Yeah. Like they don't have any way out, or they feel like they don't have a way out.
Well, let's hear what GW had to say about the standoff and how PTSD could have possibly been in play. Now, he was out of the Army on a medical discharge, Brent Kopacka, and, for about 13 years, when he was shot and killed by police. And there are some questions surrounding his death. I mean, too many to get into in this interview, but law enforcement said he had threatened to shoot his roommates, and then that's when SWAT was called. And so I'm wondering, how do you think PTSD might play into that, and how common is it for soldiers in his situation to act violently to that degree?
Well, first of all, you won't see any parchments behind my desk that say I'm a physician or psychologist or any kind of medical or psychological professional. All I can say is my own personal experience. I do know that when gentlemen or when soldiers experience PTSD and a traumatic brain injury, it's the magic cocktail, right? And if the VA was treating him with psychotropic drugs or anything like that, man, it causes big problems. Okay, you don't have to use soldiers as an example of this. NFL football players.
Right.
Suffering for traumatic brain injuries yearly, maybe monthly, maybe weekly.
Right.
You have a guy like Junior Seau left the NFL on top of the world and killed himself. You ask yourself why?
Right.
Because he just couldn't deal with the wiring was off in his head, and he just couldn't deal with either the pain, or he couldn't deal with he couldn't get outside of the self-loathing or whatever it was that he was suffering with, and we'll never know probably.
Well, after hearing all that from GW, I mean, plus the other information that we've gathered, I mean, what are your ideas here? I mean, did Brent play a role in this Idaho 4 case?
I think that he definitely had PTSD. We know that based on what people are saying, his actions, what he was on. I think he was self-medicating. We know that for sure. I think that's a definite possibility of that. As far as him being involved with the Idaho, there's always a possibility. Mm-hmm. At first, I was like really gung-ho on the idea because I was thinking he has the military background. The fact that there was no evidence left behind, that sounds like someone who is, like GW says, they plan it, they rehearse it, they know what they're doing. And then you got the forensic side with Brian. He would know how to not leave a trace. That being said, I don't think he had anything to do with this. No, I think he just was a sad, tragic PTSD story. As far as like the police involvement and how he died, that is a huge question mark to me. Right. Because that doesn't make any sense to me. And something is another cover up of this little town. Mm-hmm. And it's sad to see. There's so many, and I know you're going to do more deep, looking into other deaths and things like that. So it's not the first time we've seen this in this town. So no.
And now I want to expand upon this theory I had about how Brent may have known Emma and Demetrius. So like I said, maybe he owed them some money and that's how he got involved. Or maybe it was, they offered him substances. We don't know. But they would have known he had that combat experience. And to add to that, I wonder if they had Brent swatted. And for those of you watching that aren't aware of what that is, that's when somebody pranks a person by calling 911 to get the SWAT team to show up at their house. Now, this is incredibly scary, very dangerous. There's been several of these cases that have gone awry, but it's happening a lot. And I wonder, could Brent have been swatted by somebody? We don't know who it was, but it's just a thought, because I wonder if the cops showed up, guns blazing, because they thought this was an active hostage situation when maybe it wasn't. and things got out of hand, and maybe that exacerbated a PTSD moment, and that just turned into what it turned into. But I wonder if the cops overreacted from the swatting and then tried to cover their rear ends by making it look like it was a standoff. And that's one theory I have. What do you think about that?
I think that could be proven or disproven if we hear the 911 call.
Right.
We need to hear that call. I mean,
Right.
that would give a lot of insight as to who called this in. Now, there was a little clip that I had seen of the one of the head chiefs or head police officers, and they asked him who made the 911 call, and he said, "We don't know."
Right.
So that's very possible that could have happened. The PTSD is definitely going to be a factor here, but I think they came in hot and took him out, and then they had to figure out how to cover that up.
I think you're exactly right. Right. So yeah, I definitely think if this, happened like this, I think that's a very real possibility. Now there is a famous book, one of my favorite books by Richard Condon called The Manchurian Candidate. It was a movie and then it was a remake, very good movie, but the theory is very similar, or the story is very similar to this theory. In the book, a man comes home from the Korean War and is brainwashed by people in powerful positions to become an assassin. So lots of strange similarities to this Brent Kopacka story, if, of course, you're believing that he may have been involved in the Idaho 4. But, I don't know. I would like to believe he was not. And I, would rather give him the benefit of that doubt. But if there's any evidence that proves that happened, then I guess we can cross that bridge when we come to it. But, the jury's still out. I just wanted to portray both sides. I wanted to give Brent the respect he deserves. And let's discuss that and how that could have impacted him. But I think, hearing from GW and getting that insight, I think made this a good presentation and hopefully very fair, that people would feel that we presented both sides of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think his take is going to be, I'm hoping we'll reach other veterans that need to maybe get help.
Right.
I think it's a real issue that a lot of them don't want to get the help, or they're like, "Oh, I'm good." And then you see the aftermath of them not doing that, and what they lean on for support.
Right.
But there are people that can help. There are, organizations like you mentioned earlier that can help. So please go get that help. It's really important. You're not alone. There's a lot of people that go through that. So just want to point that out, because I've seen, like you said, we see it all the time with people we know that go through it, and it's heartbreaking. And I feel bad for Brent, that if he truly had nothing to do with the Idaho 4 and literally just needed help to deal with not only his injury that he had, which was extensive, but also what to lean on for support, and he didn't have that access there in Pullman, then that needs to be changed. I think there needs to be home offices in every city, every state for you guys to reach out to and get help. And it breaks my heart that he didn't have that.
Yeah, I agree. And then, like I said in the beginning, I mean, he was a soldier. He fought for the country, a Purple Heart, traumatic brain injury. And we're not trying to pile on and say he did this, but we just wanted to point out certainly some questions and some red flags in his life that could have certainly put him there at 1122 King Road. But, I don't see anything wrong with talking about his story and how he could have potentially been involved. But I would like to thank GW Ayers for doing the interview with me and for his service to the country. I knew he would do a great job explaining PTSD and how it impacts veterans. And I hoped it might put things in a little more realistic perspective. He's a great guy, and I'll be releasing the full interview, about 55 minutes long, very soon after this episode comes out. But I'll link below, because he is he's in charge of sales there at Rainier Arms in Kansas, and they've got a channel here on YouTube, and you can watch some other videos that he's done if you're interested to check it out. And of course, thank you, Blahgergirl, for suffering through your illness. And we've had some connection problems here today, so we managed to get through it. And I'm glad that we did, because I think this is a really good episode. And I
too.
appreciate you putting the work in as well and learning about this subject. So we'd like to thank you guys for checking out this episode of True Crime Deep Cuts. There's a variety of content here on the channel. If you like the shorter videos, I got the 666 seconds videos that I do here, where each one is 666 seconds or less. Plus, I got the interviews with the other creators and other interesting people here. The Murder Metal Mayhem podcast is available. Lots of stuff, lots of different things if you want to explore and see what's out there. But I would like to mention, of course, the Horns High Club and thank them for their membership here on the channel. I appreciate all you guys for the support, and I thank all of you that watch these videos with us. And we'll see you next time for another episode of True Crime Deep Cuts.